Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the soft, ink-stained world of ancient Egyptian Greek. Specifically, the time-consuming hobby of writing letters to people who are very dead. Picture this. You're crouched in a dim, flickering oil lamp glow, scratching complaints onto papyrus about your deceased father's terrible decision to leave his best cow to your useless cousin. The air smells of dried reeds and myrrh, and somewhere in the dark, only shadows melting into darkness. A bored temple scribe stifles a yawn while charging you extra for the fancy hieratic script. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in this gig. For one thing, your cursive hieroglyphs are atrocious. For another, you lack the emotional stamina to explain again to your dead aunt that no, her ghost cannot have your good linen sheets. They're still in use. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Is it 3 a.m. in Tokyo, high noon in Arizona, the witching hour in Berlin? Let's see how far this little insomnia cult stretches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ancient Egyptians took correspondence seriously. We're not talking thoughts and prayers scribbled on a sympathy card. These were full-blown, legally nuanced, emotionally loaded missives addressed directly to the departed. Historians still argue whether these letters were truly meant to reach the dead, or if they were more like therapeutic journaling. But either way, the vibe was, I have grievances, and by Anubis, you will hear them. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor us. The earliest known letter to the dead dates back to the Old Kingdom, circa 2600 BCE, and they kept the tradition alive for millennia. But here's the quirky bit. Some letters were written on pottery bowls. Why? Because after you poured out your heart and your beer offering, you could smash the bowl for emphasis. Cathartic and recyclable. The scratch of reed pen on papyrus fills the quiet room as you carefully compose your message to the afterlife. This isn't some hurried note scribbled in the margins of your shopping list. This is serious business, requiring the proper materials and a scribe's steady hand. You watch as the ink flows in neat columns, each symbol precisely formed, to ensure your dead relatives can actually read your complaints about their poor life choices. Historians have found these letters written on everything from scraps of pottery to fine linen, but the most formal ones used high-quality papyrus, the ancient equivalent of choosing premium stationery over a post-it note. The ink itself was a careful mixture of soot, gum arabic, and water, with the occasional addition of ochre for important flourishes. You might chuckle at the thought of someone adding decorative touches to a letter addressed to a corpse. But remember, presentation mattered. even in the afterlife. Here's a mainstream fact to ground us. The Egyptian writing system had 3 scripts: hieroglyphic for monuments, hieratic for everyday documents, and later, demotic for administrative work. But here's the quirky detail. Some letters to the dead mix these scripts in ways that would make a proper scribe cringe, suggesting either urgency or that the writer wasn't professionally trained. Maybe Great Aunt Merit couldn't wait for a proper scribe to complain about her nephew's shoddy grave offerings. Historians still argue whether these letters were actually expected to be read by the deceased, or if they functioned more like magical spells, the act of writing itself holding power regardless of delivery. Some letters include threats to stop making offerings if the dead don't comply, while others beg for mercy from ghostly harassment. The most heartbreaking ones? Simple messages from children asking why their parents had to leave them. Now comes the real question. How exactly did these letters reach their intended recipients in the afterlife? You'd think there'd be some divine postal service, but the delivery system was far more creative. Picture this. You've finished pouring your heart out onto papyrus, and now you're crouching by a tomb, carefully placing your letter alongside a loaf of bread. Not because the dead get peckish, though they might, but because bread served as the ancient equivalent of postage stamps. Historians have found letters deliberately placed in tombs, tucked into the folds of mummy wrappings, or even left at offering tables. Some were read aloud before being deposited, while others were folded and sealed with the same care as legal documents. The most elaborate ones, they were actually burned, the smoke carrying the words upward to the gods, who would then forward them to the correct afterlife department. Here's a mainstream fact. The Egyptians believed the dead could interact with the living world through dreams, omens, and these very letters. But here's the quirky detail. Some letters include food offerings as payment for the dead to actually do something about the sender's problems. Imagine mailing your landlord a pizza with your rent check and a note saying, "Fix the leaky roof or no more pepperoni." Historians still argue whether these letters represent true two-way communication or were more like wishful thinking. Some show clear signs of follow-up, additional letters complaining that the first request wasn't fulfilled, while others seem to be one-time emotional outbursts. The most amusing finds? Letters where the living threaten to stop writing altogether if they don't get a response, essentially ghosting the ghosts. The flickering oil lamp casts shadows across your face as you wrestle with how to phrase this delicate matter. How exactly do you tell your deceased father that his second wife, the one he married after your mother's death, is haunting you with unreasonable demands from beyond the grave? This is the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a group text gone horribly wrong. Some of the most revealing letters expose raw family drama that would make a modern soap opera blush There's the widow who writes to her late husband, furious that he's apparently taken up with a spirit wife in the afterlife, instead of watching over her. Or the son who complains that his dead father's ghost keeps harassing him about inheritance distribution. The pettiness is palpable. One letter even accuses a deceased relative of laziness in the underworld for not preventing a bad harvest. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptian society placed enormous importance on familial duty, which extended beyond death. But here's the quirky bit. Some letters include detailed instructions on how the dead should behave. Like an exasperated parent leaving a babysitter with a list of rules. "Stop appearing in my dreams unannounced," one reads. Another sternly reminds a spirit to share the offerings with your brother's ghost. He's hungry too. Historians still argue whether these were genuine beliefs or ritualized expressions of grief. Some letters show clear signs of psychological bargaining. "If you help me find my stolen goods, I'll double your bread offerings," while others read like pure venting. The most tragic, a mother's letter to her dead child, promising to send toys if they'll just visit her in a dream. The air is thick with the scent of incense as you dip your reed pen into ink, preparing to articulate a feeling that transcends time. Pure, unfiltered guilt. You're about to write what archaeologists now call a penitence letter, addressed to a dead parent you maybe didn't treat as well as you should have while they were alive. The modern equivalent would be drunkenly texting an ex at 2 a.m., except this message is etched onto pottery and left in a tomb for eternity. Some of these post-mortem correspondences reveal stunning emotional vulnerability. There's the son who writes to his deceased father, admitting he was wrong in an old property dispute, begging for forgiveness so the haunting will stop. Or the wife who confesses to an affair in a letter to her dead husband, not because he didn't already know. Ghosts apparently made excellent spies, but because she couldn't bear the spectral side-eye every time she brought dates home. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians believed the dead could both bless and curse the living, making these letters part spiritual negotiation, part therapy session. But here's the quirky detail. Some include itemized lists of offerings as bargaining chips. 10 jars of beer annually if you make my back pain stop. One even promises a deceased mother that her favorite cat, also dead, will be sent to keep her company if she stops giving the writer nightmares. Historians still argue whether these were true confessions or strategic performances. The most heartbreaking examples come from parents who buried children. Letters filled with raw grief that archaeologists can barely read aloud without choking up. Yet others show remarkable pettiness, like the man who wrote to his dead wife solely to remind her that her brother still owed him money. The flicker of your oil lamp dances across the legal document in your hands, because yes, even the afterlife had paperwork. You're drafting a property dispute resolution. Except the defendant is your late uncle, and the courtroom is the Hall of Osiris. Ancient Egyptians didn't let trivial matters like mortality stop them from settling scores. And some of the most fascinating letters involve legal matters that spilled over from this world into the next. Picture this. You inherit a prime piece of Nile-adjacent farmland, only to start having nightmares where your deceased great-grandfather screams about violated inheritance laws. The solution? A firmly worded letter to the underworld's small claims court, complete with witness appeals to long-dead relatives. Some letters even include threats of divine litigation. If you don't stop haunting me about the irrigation rights, I'll petition Osiris himself. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptian law recognized oral wills, but written ones were preferred, especially when disputing with ghosts. But here's the quirky detail. Some legal letters to the dead were written on broken pottery shards, ostraca, possibly so they could be ritually smashed if the ghost didn't comply. The pettiest one found, a man who wrote to his deceased business partner, demanding repayment of a 20-year-old barley loan with calculated interest. Historians still argue whether these were actual legal strategies or magical rituals disguised as lawsuits. Some letters show sophisticated legal reasoning, referencing obscure inheritance laws, while others are pure emotional blackmail. Remember who embalmed you with the expensive oils when you start dividing the afterlife property. The most bizarre case, a woman who sued her own mummified mother over a stolen jewelry box and included the judge's mummy as a CC. The scent of melted beeswax fills the air as you press your seal into the warm resin, officially stamping your complaint to the afterlife with all the bureaucratic seriousness of a tax audit. You're not just writing to the dead, you're creating an official record, folded and sealed like state correspondence. Because if you're going to accuse your deceased father-in-law of ghostly harassment, you better make it look professional. Some of these letters were treated with shocking formality, folded into neat packets, tied with string, and sealed with clay or wax, imprinted with the sender's personal signet. A few even bear administrative notations on the outside, like to the honored spirit of Nachtman concerning the stolen oxen, as if the underworld had its own postal sorting system. The most elaborate ones include dockets summarizing the contents, suggesting they might have been read aloud. Here's a mainstream fact. Seals in ancient Egypt functioned like signatures and were used for everything from grain storage to royal decrees. But here's the quirky detail. Some letters to the dead were sealed with bread dough instead of wax, creating an edible stamp that the deceased could theoretically consume along with the message. One particularly passive-aggressive example from Deir el Medina was sealed with a lump of dough shaped like an erect middle finger. Historians still argue whether these seals held magical significance or just reflected standard administrative practices. Some broken seals show clear teeth marks, spirits getting hungry, while others appear deliberately shattered, possibly representing the opening of the message in the afterlife. The most ironic find? A letter complaining about a broken tomb seal, sealed with a broken seal. The oil in your lamp burns low as you wait for a reply that never comes. How long should one reasonably wait for a response from the afterlife before assuming you've been ghosted by an actual ghost? This was the ancient Egyptian dilemma. When your carefully composed letter to dear departed Aunt Merit yields no improvement in your harvest yields or sleep quality, what's the proper etiquette? Do you send a follow-up? Escalate to a stronger curse? Resign yourself to the fact that even in the realm of the dead, your relatives remain terrible correspondents. Archaeologists have found evidence of increasingly frustrated follow-up letters, like one from a man who writes 3 times about the same stolen donkey, each version growing progressively less polite. The first begins, "To the venerable spirit of my father." The second, "Father." And by the third, it's just, "Hey, you in the underworld." Some show signs of magical amplification, with later versions written in red ink, traditionally used for important, dangerous texts, or accompanied by larger offerings, the ancient equivalent of texting "hello" in all caps. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians believed the dead could be forgetful, hence the need for repetitive rituals and reminders. But here's the quirky detail. Some people apparently gave up on writing entirely and just drew pictures of their complaints on pottery bowls before smashing them. One such letter depicts a man with speech bubbles pointing to his aching back next to a crude drawing of a ghost with an X over it. Historians still argue whether non-responses were interpreted as refusal, incapacity, or cosmic bureaucracy. Some tombs show evidence of final notices, letters threatening to stop offerings altogether, while others contain what appear to be apology letters to the dead for pestering them. The most relatable find? A scrap that simply reads, "Never mind, I fixed it myself." The flickering lamplight catches the glint of a bronze blade as you carefully etch protective hieroglyphs around your latest letter. Because when polite requests fail, it's time to escalate to supernatural legal threats. You're drafting what scholars now call a conditional curse letter, the ancient Egyptian version of "I'm not angry, just disappointed," crossed with a mafia shakedown. The basic formula? Stop giving me nightmares about your unpaid debts, or I'll tell Osiris what you really did with temple funds. Some of these letters reveal shockingly creative intimidation tactics. There's the widow who threatens to expose her dead husband's affair with a priestess unless his ghost stops haunting her new boyfriend. Or the merchant who warns his deceased business partner that he'll deliberately botch the annual mortuary offerings if the missing inventory isn't returned. The most brutal example. A son's letter listing every childhood slight his father ever committed, concluding with, "Continue this behavior, and I'll let the tomb rats gnaw your ushabtis." Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians took oaths incredibly seriously, believing the gods enforced them even beyond death. But here's the quirky detail. Some curse letters include receipts, like the man who attached a copy of his deceased father's will to prove he was being cheated. Others employ magical wordplay, twisting the deceased's own name, hieroglyphs, into threats. Imagine threatening to unfriend someone by misspelling their name on purpose. Historians still argue whether these were genuine beliefs or psychological coping mechanisms. Some letters show clear signs of being performative, written for living witnesses, while others were clearly private outbursts. The most chilling discovery? A collection of curse letters, all addressed to the same deceased vizier, suggesting either an unpopular official or a very patient ghost. The scent of lotus blossoms mixes with the earthy aroma of damp papyrus as you compose your most ambitious letter yet, not to a deceased relative, but directly to Osiris himself. You're essentially drafting an appeal to the underworld's supreme court, complete with flattery. O merciful judge of hearts, exaggerated grievances, my aunt's ghost keeps moving my furniture, and not so subtle bribes. I'll increase my temple donations tenfold. Some of the most fascinating letters attempt to bypass unresponsive spirits entirely by going straight to the top of the divine bureaucracy. These often follow strict legal formulas, opening with praises to Osiris before launching into complaints like, "The spirit of my deceased wife refuses to stop appearing in my dreams wearing the jewelry I buried with her. Please issue a restraining order." A few even come with attached evidence. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians viewed Osiris as both judge and administrator of the afterlife, capable of enforcing divine decrees. But here's the quirky detail. Some letters to Osiris were written on strips of linen and tied around mummified ibises, birds sacred to Thoth, god of writing, creating what scholars call avian airmail. The pettiest example? A man who sent duplicate complaints via ibis and baboon mummy just to cover his bases. Historians still argue whether these were actual legal appeals or elaborate religious performances. Some show sophisticated knowledge of underworld jurisprudence, while others are clearly desperate Hail Marys. The most tragic? A mother's plea to Osiris to make her deceased child stop appearing in dreams asking for food, accompanied by tiny handmade sandals as Exhibit A. The rhythmic sound of kneading dough fills your ears as you prepare the most unusual delivery system for your afterlife correspondence. Edible mail. That's right. you're baking your grievances into actual bread loaves. Because when papyrus is too expensive and cautery shards too harsh, nothing says, "I miss you," like a carbohydrate-laden complaint. These bread letters represent one of archaeology's most charming discoveries. Entire messages pressed into dough before baking, creating a literal food for thought situation. Some of these culinary communiques reveal surprisingly modern passive aggression. There's the loaf stamped with "Your grandson still hasn't fixed my roof" in crisp, hieratic script, or the ceremonial bread bearing the ominous imprint, "I know you took the copper tools." The most creative example, a circular flatbread with complaints written in a spiral, so the deceased would have to rotate it endlessly to read the. Here's a mainstream fact. Bread was sacred in ancient Egypt, appearing in nearly all religious offerings. But here's the quirky detail. Some edible letters were baked with hollow centers containing actual papyrus scrolls, creating a sort of message in a carbohydrate bottle. One such loaf from Abydos contained a petty note wrapped around a single clove of garlic, the ancient equivalent of adding insult to injury. Historians still argue whether these were meant to be eaten by the dead or simply symbolically absorbed. Some show tooth marks, suggesting ritual nibbling, while others remain perfectly preserved. The most heartbreaking find? A tiny, carefully formed loaf with a child's shaky writing, "Mother, I made this myself." The sound of splashing water echoes as you lean over the well, shouting your grievances downward into the darkness. Because when you can't afford fancy papyrus or ceremonial bread, there's always the budget-friendly option of yelling at the underworld through groundwater. This was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of leaving a voicemail, relying on the belief that wells and springs were natural portals to the afterlife. Your neighbors might think you've lost your mind, but desperate times call for desperate measures when your deceased brother's ghost keeps borrowing your good sandals without returning them. Archaeologists have identified certain wells in burial areas that show evidence of being used specifically for these vocal deliveries. The most dramatic practitioners would lower offerings, a piece of cloth, a lock of hair, while shouting their messages, creating a sort of care package for the dead. The thriftiest simply spat into the well after speaking, figuring their DNA would serve as both signature and return address. Here's a mainstream fact. Water was sacred in Egyptian cosmology, representing both the primordial chaos and the life-giving Nile. But here's the quirky detail. Some wells have hieroglyphic graffiti suggesting they were pre-programmed for afterlife calls, like ancient cell towers. One such inscription reads, "Historians still argue whether this was considered less effective than written letters or just more accessible." Some wells show layers of oil residue from lamps left burning during calls, while others contain pebbles possibly used to ring the dead like a dinner bell. The most creative example? A shaft where someone lowered a singing shard, a pottery fragment inscribed with a message meant to be read aloud by the echoing water. The torchlight reveals a treasure trove of pettiness as you sift through the Deir el-Medina archives. Because what we're dealing with now are the ancient Egyptian equivalents of viral complaint letters. These are the messages so juicy, so scandalous, or so bizarre that they were apparently copied and circulated among the living before being deposited with the dead. You're not just airing grievances to the afterlife now, you're creating content. Some of these letters achieved near legendary status. There's the infamous Crocodile Widow letter, where a woman complains her deceased husband's ghost keeps manifesting as a crocodile to scare her new lover. Or the ungrateful mummy scroll that circulated in multiple copies, detailing how a son's expensive burial arrangements for his father resulted only in more frequent hauntings about the quality of tomb paintings. The most copied? Here's a mainstream fact. Deir el-Medina's workmen kept extensive personal archives on ostraka pottery shards. But here's the quirky detail. Some viral letters show editing marks where scribes polished the phrasing, suggesting these were the ancient world's version of workshopping a savage tweet. One particularly popular curse letter exists in 3 drafts, each version more scathing than the last. Historians still argue whether these were truly shared for entertainment or served as cautionary tales. Some show annotations like "Show to Ptahhotep" in the margins, while others were clearly deposited in tombs with extra ceremony. The most meta example? A letter complaining about gossip, found copied on 12 different ostraka. The setting sun paints the desert cliffs gold as you prepare the most drastic measure of all, a cease and desist letter to the afterlife, complete with a formal notice that you'll be terminating all mortuary offerings if the spectral harassment doesn't stop. This is the nuclear option in Egyptian ghost diplomacy, the equivalent of blocking someone across all platforms while announcing it publicly. You're not just cutting off bread and beer deliveries to your dead aunt's tomb. You're updating your will to specify that future generations should ignore her too. Some of these termination notices are masterclasses in bureaucratic spite. There's the son who includes itemized lists of every offering he's ever made to his father's spirit, with estimated market values. The widow who notarizes her letter at the local temple before depositing it, ensuring the gods witness the cancellation. The most brutal, a family's joint petition to disinherit their patriarch's ghost entirely, accompanied by a ceremonial breaking of his Ushabti figurines, the ancient version of deleting someone's cloud storage. Here's a mainstream fact. Egyptians believed the afterlife required constant material support from the living. But here's the quirky detail. Some termination letters offer final warnings first, like a spectral 3-strike system. One such notice from Thebes gives a deceased wife exactly 1 lunar cycle to stop haunting before her cosmetics offerings are permanently cancelled. Historians still argue whether these were genuine rejections or negotiation tactics. Some terminated relationships show evidence of later reconciliation with apology ostraca left at tombs, while others resulted in complete abandonment of the burial site. The most poetic justice? A tomb where archaeologists found both a termination letter and the deceased's desperate but too late reply, scratched on the wall. The last rays of sunlight fade as you compose what will become one of history's final letters to the dead. Because nothing lasts forever. Not even humanity's habit of arguing with ghosts. Around the 4th century CE, as Christianity spread and old traditions faded, the practice slowly disappeared. Your pen hovers over the papyrus, wondering if this ancient conversation between the living and dead will simply stop mid-sentence. Archaeologists have found what appear to be last generation letters, showing fascinating syncretism. There's one addressed to both Anubis and Saint Peter, just to cover all bases. Another deposits a Christian prayer alongside traditional offering formulae. The most poignant, a simple wooden tablet reading, "Father, I don't know if you can hear me anymore, but the Romans taxed the vineyard again." Here's a mainstream fact. Early Coptic Christians often reused pagan tombs, sometimes preserving mummies but ceasing mortuary cults. But here's the quirky detail. Some late-period letters include crosses and ankhs, as if hedging spiritual bets. A few even show attempts at translating traditional formulae into Greek or Latin. Historians still argue whether the practice truly died out or just transformed. Modern Egyptians still leave notes at certain tombs, and the global phenomenon of letters to heaven suggests the impulse remains. The last known ancient example, a 5th century ostracon that simply says, "If you're there, knock twice."